Hi, and welcome to another narration presented by yours truly, Cryptid's Roost. So go grab your coffee, sit back and enjoy the show. And don't forget, where fear is, happiness is not. Hell to pay. This awesome story is written by Jack LaFountain. Jack LaFountain now has another book available, Tokens of Perdition. The book is available in Kindle, paperback and Audible formats. Go to houseofhonorbooks.com. The book will show up on the homepage and in their catalogue. For the Audible version, the link is below and also on that website as well. Somebody has to pay. Not only were the words printed on Rick Stewart's business cards, they were imprinted on his soul. Richard Harold Stewart, Esquire, attorney at law, personal liability lawyer, ambulance chaser, crooked shyster. Take your pick. Semantics didn't matter as long as somebody paid. Rick made a good living for himself, seeing to it that the rich, the mighty and the well-insured paid, and paid dearly. If that made Rick a slimy bottom feeder, so be it. If the settlements he won and the scope of what constituted personal injury continued to grow, he was a very happy man by any name. Rick made no bones about the delight winning gave him. His joy showed in his downtown loft, the sleek black Ferrari parked at the courthouse, and the tailored suits he wore. The golden glitter of his growing courtroom success produced a steady flow of clients. Each of them sure Rick could wring riches from bosses, landlords and negligent business owners. His tactics and decided lack of any objective morality even drew the vocal condemnation of his peers. But what really galled Rick's critics was the simple, undisputable fact that he not only was the best injury lawyer in town, but perhaps the best lawyer, period. Judge Bancroft once called Rick the ultimate waste of talent. Rick's newest gold mine was an unemployed, undocumented petty thief named Jorge Mendez. It turned out that poor Georgie was the latest in a long string of victims of Sparky, the cat from hell. Sparky belonged to Mildred Wiley, reclusive heiress of the Wiley oil fortune. It seems her cat had a nasty habit of biting and scratching anyone who dared venture near the widow's door. Rumour had it the widow herself was not beyond a bit of figurative biting and scratching of those who crossed her. Until the problem came across Rick's desk, no one cared, nor dared to press the widow on the matter of Sparky's attacks. The case was fairly simple. After slipping over the widow's back fence, George made the mistake of attempting to move the hissing, spitting feline from his path with his bare hands. George fled the scene, leaving behind his tools for getting past the locks on the widow's doors, as well as his desire for her silver. He did manage to come away with multiple deep lacerations and a nice set of puncture wounds. Those on the back of his right hand became infected when George, fearing the police were watching the hospital, failed to seek medical treatment. A week later, a cousin found George unconscious and septic. The cousin unceremoniously dumped George at the local emergency room, where he had surgery to remove the gangrenous ring and pinky fingers of his right hand. When George returned to his room after coming out of anaesthesia, he discovered that he was represented by the best injury lawyer in Clarkston County. Rick Stewart cared a great deal about pressing the matter of Sparky's violent proclivities. In situations such as this, he told George, somebody has to pay. It made no difference to Rick that good old Georgie scaled Mildred's 8-foot-tall back fence with a crowbar in one hand and a pair of bolt cutters in the other. It did not matter that Mildred had "keep out" signs posted every 6 feet along the fence. He assured George what really matters was that the signs were all in English. What mattered was that Mrs. Wiley allowed her vicious cat to roam free. It mattered that Mildred Wiley threatened anyone who came near her house. All that mattered a great deal. But what mattered most of all was that George Mendez was seriously injured and somebody had to pay. In civil suits, juries wanted to know who must pay, and Rick always had the right answer ready for them. In this case, the answer was clear. George Mendez couldn't read English. The pittance he drew from SSI since arriving in America couldn't be called a living wage. George's only crime had been trying to prevent injury to Sparky by moving him aside. He had been rewarded with pain, suffering, and permanent disfigurement. Should the hard-working taxpayers and jury members be forced to pay the tens of thousands of dollars for George's medical treatment? No, Rick would tell them. Should the people working at Clarkston Hospital go unpaid? Why, of course not. But somebody had to pay. That left Sparky and his evil mistress, Mildred Wiley. The rich widow could afford it. She let that cat run free. She practically ordered it to attack George, and therefore she deserved to pay. Rich people like Mildred Wiley kept the Georgies of the world oppressed, poor, and helpless. Rick would be sure the jury knew that there was just one thing the likes of Mildred Wiley understood: money. Rick would ask the jury to speak loud and clear so that Mildred Wileys of the world could hear. Mildred Wiley must pay. Rick could hardly wait to serve this juicy tidbit to a jury. Not that it was going to happen. Al Jantz, who was defending the widow, would never let this go to a jury. Jantz and his client would settle. The only question was how far could they be pushed. Rick visualized 7 figures. The vision grew stronger when Rick's secretary poked her head in the door and announced Mildred Wiley was waiting to see him. The widow, as it turned out, was not the pitiful bag of wrinkles and potential jury sympathy Rick expected. Mildred Wiley was 5 feet 3 inches of New Hampshire granite, chipped into human form. Her white hair drawn back into a tight bun. The sharpness of her angular features and the thin downturned lips brought to his mind the image of Lizzie Borden. Her dress, complete with high collar and long sleeves, had to have come from the Carrie Nation catalogue. Rick made a mental note not to offer her water, at least until the case was settled.
Thank you for seeing me without an appointment, Mr. Stewart.
bright blue eyes sparkled with undisguised intelligence from behind her wire-rimmed glasses. Rick started to close the door, decided something was missing, and looked back down the empty hall.
I'm afraid Mr. Jantz will not be coming today,
she said. Mrs. Wiley, I must insist your attorney be present during any... She cut him off with a wave of her hand.
Mr. Jantz no longer represents me.
She flashed Rick a disarming smile and took a chair across from his.
I shall be conducting my own affairs from this point on.
Mrs. Wiley, I don't think that's wise, Rick warned. This is an important matter. You should have legal representation. Why don't we postpone until you've had a chance to find someone else?
No need, Mr. Stewart.
There was that smile again.
I am perfectly capable of representing myself.
Rick smelled blood. He'd given her a chance. He circled in for the kill. Very well, if you're sure. A toothy smile spread across his face.
Oh yes, quite sure.
Mildred smiled in turn. You must know liability.
Mr. Stewart,
she cut him off again.
Let me make this easy. I've written a figure on this piece of paper. It's my one and only final offer.
Really, Mrs. Wiley, ultimatums are a bit premature. Rick leaned back in his chair. However, I'll be glad to look at any offer you care to make. We only want what's fair for George.
We'll see.
She pushed the slip of paper across the desk. Rick looked at the figure printed in her neat hand, blinked, swallowed hard, and looked again. His eyes rose to meet those of Mildred Wiley.
Well?
She asked. 5 million is indeed a very generous offer, but I'll have to speak with my client before I can give a firm answer.
You do that?
She gathered herself to go.
There is one condition. You and your client.
Rick thought it strange how the words "your client" could come from such dainty lips and yet sound so repulsive at the same time.
Must be at my house this evening at 8 o'clock. I shall have your money ready, in cash. It shall pass from my hand to yours, with no one the wiser. I want this over.
You have that much cash on hand?
It will be arranged. Tell your client, for once in his life, not to be late. This offer expires at 8:02. After that, as you lawyers are so fond of saying, I'll see you in court.
Without waiting for an answer, she stepped to the door. Mrs. Wiley, Rick called after her.
8 o'clock, Mr. Stewart,
she said, and was gone. Rick phoned George Mendez and arranged to pick him up at 7:45. His calls to confirm the payment arrangements with Mildred Wiley went unanswered. Rick was a bit put out with her arrogance, but for the money she was shelling out, he'd play along. Rick drove the caddy with his big trunk to the meeting. That much cash took up a lot of room. As arranged, George was standing at the curb outside Tio Juan's cantina when Rick arrived. The ecstasy of newfound wealth glowed on George's face, and nervous excitement, or body lice, had his limbs in constant motion. Before getting out at the Wiley place, Rick decided to review with his client the terms of the settlement and how they would deal with the widow once more. "Georgie," he said, "your job is to keep your mouth shut and let me do the talking. You do that and you'll walk away from here tonight with more money than you've ever seen. Comprende?"
I understand.
Good. And you understand our arrangements?
See, we split the cash 50-50. I get my $50,000 and none of this ever happened.
Good man, Georgie. You're going to do just fine.
But why does La Signora want us to come here in the night?
Because, Georgie, in cases like this, somebody has to pay. Signora Wiley understands that. She wants to avoid a big embarrassing scene in court with everyone in town knowing her business. To keep it all quiet, she was willing to pay up front in cash.
If you say so, I still feel funny about this.
That's just the feeling of money, George. Lots and lots of money. Rick had heard that the widow kept her fortune well hidden behind a veneer of cobwebs and mildew. Where those kind of stories start was anybody's guess. It sure didn't show from the curb. The Wiley house was a 3-story Victorian jewel, resplendent with gingerbread trim and twin turrets. The walk up to the hand-carved oak doors had him salivating with avaricious fantasy. They were met at the front door by a brown-skinned beauty with long black hair that cascaded over bare shoulders. Dark eyes that smouldered with latent sexuality looked up at them from beneath the flutter of long lashes. The shimmering silk clung to her curves in rich emerald waves.
"Buenas noches, señors,"
she purred. "We are here to see Mrs. Wiley," Rick announced.
"Of course. This way, please."
Her walk had the intoxicating sway of palms in a tropical breeze. Her heels clicked on the red tile floors as she led them to a sitting room just off the entrance. Rick loosened his collar to let the heat escape.
"Please, gentlemen, be seated. Signora Wiley will be with you in a moment."
"The transformation is remarkable," Rick said.
"How is that, signor?"
"The outside of the house is, excuse my bluntness, so spinster Victorian. Inside we could be in Deos or Santa Fe."
"What makes you think you are not, Signor Stewart?"
The shadow of a smile played along her lips.
"The truth, as you know, is pliable. It may be fashioned to our purposes without breaking its integrity. Isn't that so?"
"Yes, I suppose it is." A knot of uncertainty tightened in his gut. The widow apparently had done her homework and briefed her assistant well. Unlike legal today, she'd managed to quote him correctly. Rick was impressed. Maybe she could handle her own affairs.
"Perhaps you would like some wine while you wait?"
the young woman said, bending to reach the decanter on the table in front of them. Yes, that would be nice, Rick answered, his eyes unable to leave the enticing view she afforded him. The household servant smiled at him and lingered, pouring slowly to allow him time to admire her hospitality. Signora Wiley will be right with you. George took his glass and settled back into a large leather chair.
I could get used to this,
he said when she had gone. And so you shall, Georgie, so you shall. Rick figured that Georgie couldn't tell sangria from Ripple, but he decided to taste it anyway. He was surprised again. The wine was an excellent Monte Buena. The fruity taste led to a warm glow with a subtle hint of a sweet aftertaste that Rick found unusual. The taste of easy money, he told himself. The taste soon soured. The few minutes became 20. Rick's inner thermostat climbed as the minutes ticked by. He wasn't very good at waiting and had little sympathy for those who forced him into it. If the old lady was looking for a fight, she was well on her way to one. Rick loosened his tie a little more and slowed his breathing. He tried to remind himself how much money was at stake. He needed calm, but the pounding in his temples refused to allow it. Rick's building colour ratcheted his jaws tightly together and narrowed his eyes into cruel slits, unable to disguise the fire beneath them. Old woman, you don't know who you're messing with. The mumbled words forced from between clenched teeth fed his rage.
Are you okay?
George asked. Rick ignored him and began to pace. Every muscle in Rick's body was turning to steel. He was definitely not okay. Not at all. We're leaving, Rick announced.
But the money,
George pleaded. Don't worry about the money. A lipless smile stretched over teeth poised to bite and tear. She's gonna pay all right, God help me. She is really gonna pay. Come on. Rick was at the door, hand reaching for the knob before George could move. A sudden growl from the lawyer's throat froze George as he rose from the seat. Locked. That old... Rick searched in vain for words. She's locked there. The girl. She's gonna try and... on me. Rick bellowed. George fell back onto the sofa. The fear Rick saw on his client's face was deeply satisfying. He knew that look. He'd worn it himself as a boy. That look said things were about to start getting smashed, and it was good to avoid being one of those things. Seeing it on George reminded him to retreat and get control of himself.
Sorry for the wait,
a female voice said from across the room.
My lady was detained, but she will see you gents now. Please be so kind as to follow me.
The voice belonged to a dark-haired, middle-aged maid. At least Rick supposed her a maid. The woman looked more like a retired linebacker. She had a thick body and bowed legs that had only the most fleeting of an acquaintance with a razor. Her heavy arms ended in hairy fists bunched against her hips. The woman looked more like a Mary Popeye than Mary Poppins. It's about time, Rick hissed. The appearance of someone else in the room eased the internal pressure and slowly deflated much of what was left of his anger. Rick and Wiley's maid exchanged glares before donning professional smiles and getting back to the business at hand. The apron-wearing mountain led them through the door behind her to the foot of a grand staircase. The ornate Victorian decor Rick expected swallowed them up. "What happened to Santa Fe?" Rick asked. "Santa Fe, love? What do you mean?" "The southwest, like in this route." Rick looked back into a thoroughly Victorian parlour. "Something the matter?" she asked. "Hell yes, something's the matter. We was just sitting in—" "Oh hell, never mind," Rick said. "Let's get this over with." "Very good, love. This way then." Rick and George were ushered into a small office at the top of the stairs. Inside, Mildred Wiley, her hands folded primly in front of her, sat behind a massive mahogany desk.
"That will be all for now, Mrs. Harrington."
The widow smiled and waved the maid away.
"I am deeply sorry for the delay, gentlemen."
She turned to peer over her glasses at Rick.
"I hope you weren't too uncomfortable. Mrs. Harrington had a difficult time bringing up your money. Such a sum is a trifle heavy."
Rick and George's eyes were drawn to a pair of identical black footlockers with RAF stenciled in large white letters on the top.
"I'm afraid the sum we agreed upon is rather bulky as well."
She nodded at the footlockers.
"All arranged as you specified, Mr. Stewart. Now, before we sign the final agreement, I have 3 small provisos."
"Now wait a minute, Mrs. Wiley," Rick said.
"Oh bother, Mr. Stewart. Hear an old woman out. You shall have your money. I only wish to ask a few simple questions. For my own peace of mind, you see. I'm paying a rather large sum of money. I should think you could do me the courtesy of hearing them."
"Of course, Mrs. Wiley, of course. My apologies. Ask your questions," Rick said.
"The first question is for you, Mr. Stewart."
Rick nodded and motioned for her to go on.
"Do you believe in accidents, sir?"
"I'm assuming that by accident you mean an unforeseen occurrence for which no one is responsible. Am I correct?"
"You are."
"Then my answer is no. Every effect has a cause. Every cause is initiated by a personal action. Regardless of intent, that person is responsible for the cause and the effect. I believe it was Sir John Davies that said, 'Much like a subtle spider which doth sit in middle of her web, which spreadeth wide. If aught do touch the utmost thread of it, she feels it instantly on every side.' That's very much our world. You may touch the web inadvertently, but that doesn't matter to the spider. That's why, Mrs. Wiley, in cases like these, somebody always has to pay."
"Last week I read in the papers about a man that was struck by lightning while playing golf. Do you mean to tell me the golfer initiated the storm?"
No, indeed. The responsible party is the golf course operator who let that man out to play with a thunderstorm approaching.
You're incredible, Mr. Stewart. So the golfer has no responsibility to himself?
I don't see your point. The golfer is an innocent bystander just out to enjoy his leisure time. What exactly would you have him be responsible for?
Is he not to blame for his own blind action?
Not blind. Innocent. He is not to blame for wanting a few moments relaxation. Don't you expect to be safe when you pursue your pastimes?
So, somebody else is always to blame for our misfortune?
Misfortune is made possible only by negligence. Absolutely, Mrs. Wiley. Somebody always has to pay.
I thought as much. What about Job, Mr. Stewart?
Job?
Yes, the man from the Bible. The man with all the patience.
Yes, I know the story.
Well, Job was an innocent man pursuing his leisure, as you would tell it. God struck him with disaster after disaster, even physical pain and suffering. Who is to blame? God?
Actually, I believe it was the devil that did the striking.
So it was. Shall we blame the devil?
I suppose we could if any of these things actually happened, or any of these characters existed.
When you blame the devil, Mr. Stewart, won't there be hell to pay?
Rick shrugged and smiled. I suppose so. The widow turned her attention to George.
Very well, Mr. Mendez. My second question is for you. I want you to answer freely, no matter what Mr. Stewart has told you. This case is already decided. You shall have your money regardless of your answer. Do you understand?
I understand.
What were you doing in my backyard, Mr. Mendez?
George began to fidget. He was unsure what to do with his hands or if his hair was in place. He opened his mouth to speak and abruptly changed his mind. Mrs. Wiley, really, it doesn't matter, Rick said.
It matters to me,
Mildred screeched. Her eyes blazed as she jumped to her feet and leaned across the desk. Rick could see the blood pulse in her temples and the cords stand out on her neck. Gradually the arterial beat slowed and the flush ebbed from Miss Mildred's face. She sat, smoothed the wrinkles from her lap and began again.
Let's just say I have millions of reasons for wanting Mr. Mendez's answer. You came here to rob an old woman, didn't you? Well, you were leaving with my money. Be man enough to answer.
It was George's turn to brighten with anger. He swallowed hard.
Yes, I came here to steal from you,
George said stiffly.
And now I will go.
George stood and hauled the footlocker up on his shoulder. I think it would be best if we both left, Rick agreed. carrying the heavy chests reduced their pace to a slow waddle. But as far as they were concerned, the interview was over. Mildred Wiley was not to be deterred. She stuck her head out of the office and called after the two men.
Aren't you gentlemen interested in my third question?
No, not really, Rick answered.
But it's an ever so amusing question. Are you sure you wouldn't like to hear it?
Oh, very well. Ask it quickly, Rick said, setting his load down and turning towards her.
My third question for the both of you is...
Well, go on, Rick said and made a circular motion with his hand.
It's just this,
Mildred said, her lips curling into a wicked smile.
How do you plan to get out of here alive?
The room swam wildly out of focus. Rick wasn't sure if it was his head or the room that began to spin. Whichever it was, his stomach lurched, threatening to lose its contents. Rick planted his palm against the wall to steady himself. George was not so lucky. The banister he grabbed for support gave way, sending him down the stairs in a series of thumps and wounded curses. As he hit bottom, the sound of bones snapping like a branch broken off a tree filled the room, leaving George with both legs bent at impossible angles. He moaned as he writhed in pain at the foot of the stairs. The dust raised by the thief's fall, filled with dry rot and decay, rushed up to meet Rick. It stung his eyes and unleashed a flood of tears. Rick blinked away the water from his eyes and wiped them with his shirt sleeve to clear his vision. The house changed again. The draperies laid in tatters over boarded windows. The stray shafts of light from the streetlights outside found the cracks in the walls, spotlighting torn wallpaper and moth-eaten furniture. Cobwebs hung from every corner. Bare light fixtures with broken bulbs testified that light had lost the battle for that house long ago. The floors were bare and scarred, except where blood ran from one of George's fractured legs. Rick turned back to his hostess. The house was not all that had changed. Mildred Wiley tottered from her office on ancient joints that popped and cracked with each step. The old crone Rick first imagined had come to life. Her face, yellowed with age and creased by innumerable crevices, offered him a toothless smile. She hooked an arthritic finger at him. His sudden terror produced a cackle of delight. Below him, George screamed with fresh pain. The mange-pocked Sparky stood on George's chest and raked his face with its claws. Blood and gore from George's right eye streamed from between his fingers. Sparky hissed and continued his onslaught. His teeth fastened on George, ripping away the tip of the bleeding man's nose.
My dear Mr. Stewart,
Mildred croaked and tapped his shoulder with a fungus-infested nail.
Looks like there may be hell to pay after all.
Mildred hooked the nails into Rick's shoulder, tearing through his coat. The terrified lawyer bolted down the stairs, one hand still dragging his newfound riches. Midway down, a tread buckled beneath Rick's feet, sending him through the rotten wood to his waist. The RAF footlocker slipped from his grasp. The treasure bounced down the steps, littering them with $100 bills, and coming to rest on George's broken right leg. Rick struggled to free himself. Rusted nails and jagged planks dug into the flesh of his stomach. Blood trickled down his legs into the dark realms under the stairs. Sparky continued to bite and claw at the shredded mass of flesh that was the remnant of George's face. When he was still, Sparky settled on her haunches to lick the blood from her coat.
Hell to pay, Mr. Stewart,
Mildred reminded him.
Somebody has to pay, you know. Well, it's time to pay up, dearie.
Rick groaned in despair and loss. He'd heard the sound from his opponents. Until that moment, he'd never appreciated their pain. He'd never negotiated from defeat before. But he knew the litany. He wasn't sure which hurt worse, the wood digging into his flesh or the rotten taste of defeat. "What will it take to settle this?" he said with a sigh. The answer was a soft laugh and the sound of Mildred calling,
"Here, kitty, kitty, kitty."
And I hope you enjoy the blooper reel. Rick made no bones about the delight winning. Each of them sure Rick could wring riches from... Each of them sure Rick could... But what really galled Rick's Cryptid... But what really galled Rick's Cryptid... But what really galled Rick's Cryptids... Fuck's sake. With a cobra... The vision grew stronger when Rick's secretary poked her head in the door. "You have that much..." Fuck's sake. "You have that much..." Fucking hell.
But why does La Senorita want us to come here in her...
The fear Rick saw on the... Don't you expect to be safe when you pursue it? The room swam wildly out. Fucking hell. The room span... Fucking hell. The room's... Rink blick... Blood tickled. Hey family, please be so kind as to throw punch the like button and smack the ass of the subscription button as well. And remember to chokehold that notification bell and then select all. That way you'll receive all notifications each time I upload a new video. And by subscribing, you'll be the first to see all of our new spooky creepypasta stories. A very big thank you to Jack LaFountain for allowing me to narrate this awesome story. Make sure to check out his book, Tokens of Perdition, on the House of Honor Books website. And why not hashtag Cryptids Roost in your comments. A quick thank you to all of my Cryptids Roost community family too. We are now well on our journey to 1,000 subscribers. If you would like to throw me $1 or $3, I'd be very much appreciative. I do have PayPal, paypal.me/cryptidsroost. Alternatively, I have an account at buymeacoffee.com. You don't even need to register on either site to donate. I have a subreddit if you have a story you've written that you would like me to narrate for you. You can also follow us. All my socials are contained within the Linktree link below. And don't forget to check out the end screen, see above, that will also list some more videos in my back catalogue. All the links are below. Take care everyone, and I hope you all have a wonderful and peaceful night. And don't forget, where fear is, happiness is